On this edition of Independent Sources, Hollywood Shuffle. Can the recent firestorm over Hollywood's lack of diversity really spell change for what we see on the big and small screen? And an unlikely union, exploring the historical relationship between the city's Irish and Italians. Those stories and more coming up. Welcome to Independent Sources, bringing you news from New York's ethnic and immigrant communities. I'm Gary Pierre. The recent uproar over the lack of diversity amongst this year's Oscar nominees has highlighted a problem that Black actors and directors have bemoaned for years. Even with the changes that the Film Academy's president, Cheryl Boone Isaac, says will be made, there is still concern that many minorities will still be passed over for roles on the big and small screen. Adi Ishola spoke to Dr. Alfred Martin, visiting professor at the New School's Department of Media and Culture, about mainstream media's diversity problem and what can be done to address it.
Welcome, Dr. Martin.
Thank you for having me.
So the Academy Award nominations were announced recently, and no single actor of color was nominated in the major categories, or at all, I believe.
Right, at all.
Yeah. So do you feel that this is Hollywood as usual, or is this sort of a decline in how things are being handled in Hollywood?
So I think on one hand it is Hollywood as usual. One of the things that I initially started to grapple with when all of the hubbub happened about the nominations is to wonder initially, how is this different from what has happened in years past? And as a general rule, it's actually not quite that different. And so part of what I think the conversation needs to shift toward is, on one hand, I've heard a lot of call for additional production, particularly Black production in Hollywood, and I certainly think that that will be part of the fix, as well as the Academy coming out and saying that they were going to adjust the ways in which they have members of the Academy, who of course are the folks voting. So that's also part of it. But I think another part of it that we're actually not really talking about, which is also really a kind of tough thing to tackle, is that we actually have to sort of figure out how we can switch what quality means, because ostensibly Oscars are an arbiter of quality, and so we have to in some ways figure out a way to shift what means quality. And I would argue that a Black cast film that particularly a lot of Black folk watch and a lot of Black people have an affective response to, and that we think is really good, are typically films that aren't recognized by the Academy, because in some ways, Blackness and brownness in particular really start to always already mean not quality.
Yeah.
And so it needs to get to that quality space, it often has to fit into a set of predetermined kind of narratives.
Yeah, like biopics.
Right, biopics and Black bodies being buked and scorned through slavery and and sort of before we overcame in the civil rights era. And so when we are in those kinds of spaces are usually the times in which we have the better opportunities to be acknowledged by the Academy.
And this also brings up diversity in media in general. Like, I think of the show Empire and how it's become hugely popular, but a lot of people are questioning the contents of the show and how it's depicting Black people. How do you feel about that?
What I think is part of the conversation is that Black folks are working in Hollywood, which we can't discount that.
Yeah.
The other thing I think is that when we look at a show like Empire, it is very easy to sort of spot the kinds of stereotypes that it traffics in. But I think that when one watches Empire more wholly, what we actually find out, particularly if we watch a character like Cookie, who is played by Taraji P. Henson, we actually see this sort of depth of character that if we stop at looking at the stereotype of perhaps the sassy Black woman, that we actually miss out. So we miss out on this notion that she is a really fiercely protective mother. We miss out on this notion that she is actually a sexually virtuous woman, in the sense that through exposition, we learn that her only sexual encounter has been with Lucius, other than I believe she's had a sexual relationship within the context of the show as it moves forward. But we sort of find out that this is a woman who married the man with whom she lost her virginity, and so that is in some ways an image of Black womanhood that we don't always see.
Yeah, it's true. In your work, you focus a lot on how gay Black men are portrayed. Can you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, so oftentimes what I'm interested in when I'm thinking through and thinking about images in television, I'm really interested in the relationship between production, and so whether that means writing, whether that means the actual act of filming, and actually audience response. And so what I think is really fascinating about this turn that we have taken, and I would argue that that Tyler Perry's The Haves and the Have-Nots does this, as does Empire. We actually are finally, in some ways, getting Black gay representation that is showing up as an integral part of the narrative. And so previously, if we sort of go back, many of the Black gay representations have really been episodic. So they've come on, they've come out, they've done sort of something for an episode, and then they're gone. But what is really, in some ways, and certainly Empire as well as The Haves and the Have-Nots are problematic in other ways, but what is really fascinating about what they're doing is that for the first time, we're actually seeing Black gay characters on Black cast television as part of these, as integral parts of these families, and they're not always just performing the function of coming out.
Do you ever feel like those characters are stereotypical in any way? Because I hear that a lot from people.
So I think that, the notion of stereotype is really kind of tricky because if we look historically and we go back to sort of the early stages of television when we had sort of gay men who were often hairdressers or interior designers and were sort of marked by these kinds of behaviors that we might understand as being more feminine, that was actually a problem. And starting in 1972 with All in the Family and their episode Judging Books by Covers is when we actually started to see some kind of a shift, even as it was an episodic shift. And so now that we have actually gotten to what many term a post-gay era or even a post-Will and Grace era, the ways in which we understand televisual gayness is often through hegemonic masculinity. So the good representations, if you will, are the ones that hew more closely to the ways that we think of cisgendered men are supposed to behave. And so in some ways, that in itself is also become a stereotype. And so part of what becomes problematic about trying to fix stereotypes or trying to spot stereotypes is this idea that in trying to correct for one stereotype, we actually create another one.
Wow. Let's talk a bit about Shonda Rhimes. She's kind of changed things. She brought a scandal and How to Get Away with Murder. How do you feel about her presence in the industry?
So I think that her presence in the industry is sort of a double-edged sword in the sense that Shonda Rhimes is doing a lot for particularly women of color in terms of production for television. She is also centering, at least in sort of starring roles, she is centering Black women in drama. However, she part of what the issue with her is that often she is creating characters that are racially imprecise. And so part of what people who are watching and taking in Shonda Rhimes' shows, particularly women of color, are feeling like they have to do so much work to make these series resonate with them as Black women. And so Shonda Rhimes is doing a lot in terms of actually giving Black women on television work. But I think she still has a lot of some ways that she can go. I don't think she will because, of course, the balancing act is working in Hollywood and sort of appeasing certain constituencies. I think sort of to sort of do a counterpoint to Shonda Rhimes, I think the Akeels are actually doing really great work on BET with Being Mary Jane, which I think in some ways Mary Jane Paul stands on the shoulders of Olivia Pope, but I think partially because it is the difference between ABC and BET, because it is the difference in sort of the profiles of the network. I think that Being Mary Jane is actually able to do some things that ABC would, even with all her power, I don't think that ABC would allow Shonda Rhimes to do.
Yeah, you use the term racially imprecise. What exactly do you mean?
So by that I mean that Shonda Rhimes suggested she just writes characters and then she casts them with the best actor. And so when you sort of employ that kind of ideology, what happens is that you end up with a black person in a role that hasn't been written for a black person. And so in some ways, Kerry Washington's Olivia Pope reads as universal, which is of course not by, is by design, but by the same token, there is nothing that necessarily tethers her to a kind of black experience. And so the moments in Scandal that particularly were the moments that black viewers, if Twitter is to be believed, that at least the black Twitterverse glommed onto, are actually moments with Papa Pope. And when he's when he is actually sort of bringing a kind of blackness to the role that Kerry Washington as Olivia Pope, as written on the page, isn't doing. And so a lot of folks suggest that Shonda Rhimes is too much work. Yes, and because they want it to be black, but it's not sort of black enough. And so when we move to something like How to Get Away with Murder, that gets sort of closer in the sense that we see Viola Davis take off her wig. We see her sleep in a headscarf. And many of my academic black women friends are like, hallelujah, like there's a black woman on TV.
It resonated,
in a headscarf versus Kerry Washington, gets in the swimming pool or gets in the shower and gets her hair wet. And and it just curls up and and it looks it as a friend of mine calls it, has Django hair, like the hair that she had in Django Unchained.
I have friends who say she dresses like a white woman. So I totally get it. What do you think of web series and their role in changing things or maybe providing opportunities for black actors?
So I think that web series, on one hand, do provide a really important outlet for black and brown creativity. I don't think that web series will ultimately usurp the power of television, because what we see with web series, and certainly not to discount anyone who is making web series, but as a general rule, the people who make web series often don't want to just be making web series, even as their web series are fantastic. Many of them actually want to go on and fry bigger fish, if you will. And so what we see with television, or with web television that is things like, the things that would actually be on television anyway get sort of sucked out of the web space and put on television. So Broad City is a great example of a series that starts as a web series and is picked up by Amy Poehler and then gets produced for Comedy Central. The flip side of that is that Issa Rae with Awkward Black Girl, which was a wildly successful and popular web series, she just sort of, swung in the wind for a long time before she finally got a deal to produce a pilot for HBO.
She said people approached her and they wanted to change the characters.
Exactly.
Which wouldn't make sense for the actual show.
Exactly. So, so the logics of television and the logics of television viewership, continue to reassert themselves in the sense that, we want it to be, black but not too black. We want it to be, we want it to be brown but not too brown. And so, for people of color working in television, both in front of and behind the camera, it is this constant sort of balancing act between what, do we really want to stand by our principles or do we want to work? And so that's often the dance that they have to dance.
So what do you think can be done?
there is a beauty and a utility in the increase of series that are featuring Black actors and actresses. There is a greatness to the notion that there are more Black and brown showrunners, there are more Black and brown writers, and so all of that stuff is good. I think where we have the most to gain is that we're still sort of, as much as we like to believe that we're in a post-racial world, or at least as much as we are told that we live in a post-racial world, the fact is that Black and brown people on television tend to sort of color our televisions too much for viewers. And so because the Academy is largely the academies, so both the television and film academies are mostly filled with white folk. They watch and celebrate series with other white folk in them. And so part of it is really changing the fabric of the academies, which I think that particularly the Film Academy has actually made gestures toward attempting to change. So perhaps that will increase some kind of recognition for actors and actresses of color who are actually doing really good work. And I don't think anyone is advocating for bad stuff to be celebrated, but Black and brown folks are pretty fantastic, and they do a lot of really fantastic work that doesn't get recognized by the industry.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Dr. Martin.
Thank you for having me.
This was a great conversation.
When we come back, exploring the love-hate relationship between New York's Irish and Italians. Before that, Crystal Lowe has some other news.
Thanks, Gary. Here's a look at some headlines from New York's ethnic and community media. El Diario La Prensa reports that a recent series of raids in Georgia, North Carolina, and Texas have left immigrants around the country terrified that they may soon face the same fate. Federal authorities have netted 121 people, including men, women, and children, who are now in the process of being deported to their home countries. Activists and pro-immigrant organizations have been fighting to crack down on these raids, citing that they provoke the increase of chronic stress in the community. They are defining it as Ulysses syndrome. The syndrome is a psychological disorder that owes its name to the mythological hero Ulysses, the main character in Homer's Odyssey, who faces adversity away from his family. It is characterized by chronic stress and extensive grief. Because the disorder is relatively new to psychological diagnosis, activists are afraid that the syndrome might be trivialized and overlooked by some mental health professionals. In other news, the National Institute for Latino Policy reports on layoffs at El Diario and how this brings into question the city's support of the ethnic media. El Diario, New York City's largest Spanish-language newspaper, dismissed 13 employees this month due to cost cuts. Public hearings are being held to advocate on behalf of the former employees, as well as come up with new economic incentives to help the paper maintain its print edition and strengthen its local coverage. Advocates not only want to help former El Diario employees restore their jobs, they also want to come up with ways to ensure that other immigrant communities don't run the risk of losing their local newspapers as well. A new building to be unveiled in Chinatown this summer may be the bridge that connects its past to its future. According to Tsingtao Daily, the luxury hotel cost $70 million to build. The developers are hoping that the 22-story building will become the area's new landmark. Joseph Chu designed the building. He was the pioneering member of the Chu family who settled in New York in 1949. His son Alex Chu sketched the designs, and his grandson Jonathan executed the construction. The hotel is expected to create more than 200 jobs for the community, with exhibition space for the Museum of Chinese America and a time capsule laid at its foundation that contains cultural elements of present Chinatown. And finally, The Village Voice reports that critically acclaimed filmmaker and director Chris Bell would take a look at the pharmaceutical drug industry and its impact on substance abusers in his new documentary titled Prescription Thugs. The documentary delves into the deregulation of the pharmaceutical drug industry in the 1980s and its contribution to the widespread culture of prescription drug dependency in the United States. The film is now showing at Village East Cinema in Lower Manhattan. Those were just a few headlines from the city's ethnic and community media. Independent sources will be right back.
Thanks for staying tuned. This week's On the Shelf segment focuses on the book by Paul Moses called An Unlikely Union. The tome tells the tale of the long and intertwined history shared by New York's Italians and Irish. I spoke with the book's author, former Newsday editor, and current Brooklyn College professor Paul Moses. Paul, the Irish were in New York in large numbers for the longest time, Catholics fighting the Protestant establishment. Then came the Italians, Catholics. So naturally, you would think that they had allies in their fight against the Protestants. But conflicts arise instead. Why?
Yeah, you're right. You would think, Gary, that they would get along well because they were in the same churches, but in a lot of ways, those churches at first became a battleground for them. I think part of the reason was just that they were fighting on the outside, too, economically, for jobs, and that spills over into the parish churches. But there's also very different ways of being Catholic, and so that's also a source of conflict.
What other sources of conflict that arose among these two groups?
Well, there was a lot of fighting around construction jobs, working on the waterfront. The main problem was that the Italians came in large numbers and were willing to work for less money than the Irish, who were here earlier and had established unions. And they were also willing to work longer hours. So employers were exploiting that, and that led to lots of conflict. Yeah, and I think that is the beginning of it, and it spills over into the unions and the civil service, and eventually into politics. Okay. So yeah, there was a lot of, I would say, hatred actually there because of that.
In the book again, you write about how the Italians, because most of them came from Sicily, the southern part of Italy, they were not accepted fully as white. And so how did they feel about sort of finding themselves being non-white?
I think from their point of view, they were so proud of who they were that discussion didn't make much of a dent on them. They knew they were discriminated against. They knew the deck was stacked against them. But one of the things that I learned from looking closely at this, and I am, half Italian, half Southern Italian.
Yes, you talked about that in the book
was the great pride of these peasant people, even if they weren't literate, that they kind of knew who they were. So yeah, the outside society had these racist hierarchies that they imposed, not just people on the street, but I mean academic opinion in those days. Created those kind of structures, and yeah, the Italians were at the bottom of that.
But I remember not too long ago, a lot of Irish people in New York talk about the signs, no Irish need to apply. So the Irish, it's not as if they were accepted as well.
The Irish faced a tough road. 1880 is the year the Italians first start coming in big numbers. It's also the year the first Irish Catholic mayor of New York was elected.
And who was that?
William R. Grace. Okay. And one thing that really captured it for me, what the Irish were against, was even at that pretty late date, the New York Times ran an editorial on the elections basically saying not to vote for Grace because this is, quote, an American Protestant city. So yeah, they were still up against it for a long time, and that, as we know, continues into the 1920s and maybe even up into the 1960s with the election of President Kennedy.
Yeah. Now, there was a lot of conflict. There were a lot of fights between the Irish and the Italians, but they did have a lot in common, and they did come together. In your book, you talk about that. Can you elaborate on that? How they found a common ground and how socially their relationship evolved?
Yeah, that's what makes it a story for me, is that eventually they do come together. They overcome those many decades of distrust. And that starts happening in the years after World War II with a massive round of intermarriage. Okay. So I think it's because they did begin to mingle as equals in all these arenas where they once fought. So in their neighborhoods, in their churches, in their jobs, in the unions, in associations like veterans associations after the war. They get to know each other. They move out of their old ethnic enclaves and into more residential areas. And again, they become neighbors and get to know each other. Their kids play ball together and all that. People go to school together. So that makes change.
Okay. So basically, the more they got to know each other, the more they realized they had more in common.
I really think that's all there is to it. You know, there are barriers between ethnic and racial groups, and they can be tough to overcome. Some people, I was interested in those people who begin to cross the barriers, because they're kind of the heroes of the story to me.
And it's, to some extent, that story is partly your story as well. Can you talk about that a little bit?
I've benefited from it. My wife, her ancestry is Irish. I'm half Italian. My father was German Jewish, and so yeah, at one time these kinds of unions would have been looked at, you know, with a lot of skepticism and maybe anger and hatred. So that for the Irish and the Italians, that changed, and so I became interested in how that was happening. For me, when I got married in 1976, nobody said, "Oh, she's marrying an Italian guy." It wasn't like that. But you know, 20, 30, 40, 50 years earlier, yes, that would have happened.
Now, today, when you look at New York State, the city, look at the mayor of New York City, the governor,
right,
the attorney general. There's a trend here. You see what I'm getting at? They're all Italians American. The Italians now really taking over politically in the city.
You know,
in the state, for that matter.
We do have an Italian mayor and governor, but I don't know if that's necessarily the case. You know, Italian political power dates back even to the 50s in New York. There was that year, the three major candidates for mayor were all not just Italian Americans, but born in Italy. So that's around the time that changed.
And who were those candidates?
Let's see. It was Impellitteri, Corso, and the other one slips my mind right now. Pecora.
And LaGuardia became mayor. He was the first Italian.
Earlier on, yeah.
Okay.
Impellitteri was the one who was elected in that special runoff. They were replacing an Irishman, William O'Dwyer, who left office early. Yeah.
Now, in contemporary New York, if you look at the trajectory of both groups, who would you say have achieved a lot more than the other?
Oh, you're asking me to hurt my marriage, lose a lot of my friends. I don't know. They're both very accomplished and brought a lot to the life of the city, as other ethnic groups have too.
One of the things I wanted to discuss here to this point is that as a Haitian American, you know, we're facing now some of the things that you described that the Irish and the Italians face.
For sure.
And we have our conflicts, although less so now than 20 years ago with the Caribbean and African Americans. And at some point when, you know, you think that it's going to overcome, we're going to overcome these difficulties and these misunderstandings, and I see that happening now. In your experience, what happens, you know, that where people just click and realize that they have more in common than they have differences?
I think a key thing is that people relate to each other as equals. For as long as the Irish were going to be the foremen and the Italians were always the workers, I don't think you see that common ground forming. So I think that level of equality, it comes through, you know, rising economically. It also comes through just having heroes in public life like Joe DiMaggio, Fiorello LaGuardia. I think those kind of figureheads, people in entertainment, do count a lot. Frank Sinatra for Italians. So,
that's another aspect that I wanted to discuss with you about the entertainment with the Irish and Italian taking the stage. But unfortunately, we have to have that discussion some other time.
Okay.
Another time. Paul Moses, thanks for joining us.
Pleasure, Gary. Thanks.
That's our show this week. Thanks for staying tuned. Till next time, be independent-minded.